quiet and warm. The last colors of the sunset were almost gone, and the sky, having gained an incredible depth of blue, revealed the twinkling lights of the first stars. Early spring is the best time in this marshy area. When the snow has melted, the soil has dried out, the first greenery begins to appear, but the pesky bloodsuckers haven't yet awakened. This lasts literally a week or two, and Vadim managed to catch this wonderful moment coming to visit his grandfather during a short vacation. They stayed late at the fishing spot, chatting away. At some point, his grandfather startled and quickly began packing up, muttering, "Stupid old fool, we should have left before sunset. Come on, help me." Vadim started gathering the gear too, but without hurrying. He looked at his grandfather and smiled, fussing, grumbling, just like in childhood. "Don't drag your feet, Vadika. We need to get the hell out of here." "Don't worry, Grandpa. The swamp creatures won't steal us," Vadim replied with a smirk. He had heard, since childhood, the local tales about evil spirits that lived in these swamps. Every year, year after year, coming to visit his grandfather, Vadim heard those scary stories. But he had never seen anything himself, so he didn't believe. However, he respected his relatives' feelings and followed the rules strictly observed by all the villagers. In particular, he never walked through the meadows after sunset. When he was small, he didn't care. But now, as a grown man who had found his place in the noisy metropolis, Vadim had long stopped believing in fairy tales. He believed only in his own strength. And now, seeing his dear grandfather so flustered and nervously looking around, Vadim felt a strange tenderness. It reminded him so much of the atmosphere from when he was just a little boy. But Grandpa had no time for reminiscing. He was seriously afraid. Fear and even panic radiated from him. "That's it. We're leaving," he commanded, putting on his backpack. Their path lay along the edge of the swamp. A thin veil of mist hovered over the tall grass. The damp wind carried both warmth and chill. Hurrying after his grandfather, Vadim was just enjoying himself, admiring the landscape, when suddenly, something changed. In an instant, the serene charm of the quiet evening was replaced by incredible tension and a sense of dread. Nothing had happened, but everything went silent at once. The evening bird calls, the croaking of the first frogs, the wind, even the water, it seemed, was gurgling more quietly. And then came a wave of such terror that Vadim felt every hair on his skin stand on end. At that moment, his grandfather grabbed his hand and said quietly, almost in a whisper, "Keep walking as we were. Don't you dare run. And don't look back. Don't let go of my hand." And oh, how badly he wanted to run. Run with all his might. Vadim had never experienced such wild, primal fear in his life. And then, out of the corner of his eye, out in the swamp, Vadim saw something glowing, as if someone was walking with a candle in hand. His urge to turn and take a better look was cut off by his grandfather's whisper. "Don't you dare. Don't turn your head. Just look straight ahead. Otherwise, we're corpses." Vadim obeyed. His entire body, his instincts, his nervous system, everything was at its limit, raging from mystical horror. He gripped his grandfather's hand as if it were the only thread connecting him to the life paradigm that was now shattering to pieces. It felt like an eternity had passed before the first village street appeared, though in reality, only a couple of minutes had gone by. Vadim didn't even understand how they ended up near the family house. At the gate stood his grandmother. In the dim light of the street lamp, Vadim saw that her eyes were red from crying. She gave both her husband and grandson a couple of hearty smacks on the back of the head as they entered the gate. Then came a hail of scolding and accusations for staying so carelessly late by the swamps, for risking their lives and so on. But Vadim already heard it all like sweet music. He was safe. Life went on. Just before entering the house, Vadim glanced toward the swamps visible beyond the fence. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing, but then his mind managed to formulate the image. A light, like that of a burning candle, was slowly floating in the air, and behind it, just as slowly, drifted a tall, black shadow. Part 2. The last glimmers of sunset had faded, plunging the quiet village into the deep blue of night. Vadim sat in an armchair, trying to relax, but his hands still trembled treacherously. Sipping herbal tea, he watched his grandmother once again walk from window to window, carefully closing the curtains so that not a single gap remained. He had seen this ritual every time he stayed here. As soon as dusk fell, the curtains were drawn with special care, and looking out the windows was strictly forbidden under no circumstances. A memory suddenly resurfaced in Vadim's mind, already covered with the dust of time. No wonder he had been only 7 or 8 at the time. He was dozing off in bed, his grandfather quietly watching television, and his grandmother knitting beside him, when suddenly a hurried, insistent knock on the window shattered the drowsy calm. By the way, the beginning of the story is here. Vadim remembered sitting up and asking, "Granny, who is it?" But she just shushed him and put a finger to her lips. Her eyes, she was clearly frightened. The knock came again. The lazy ginger cat suddenly stood up, arched its back, staring intently at the window, then bolted under the couch like a bullet. Grandma and Grandpa sat motionless. Catching their mood, Vadim froze too. Sticky fear, like cold mist, began to seep into the room. A knock came at another window. Then a third. Then from the far side of the house. And then the knocking started on all the windows at once. Little Vadim clamped his hands over his ears. It was unbearable. He saw his grandmother close her eyes and begin to whisper something under her breath, while his grandfather clenched his fists nervously. Then silence. Sudden and absolute. A ringing, total silence. In the morning, the incident wasn't discussed. Not then, and not ever after. Vadim had tried asking questions, but was quickly hushed. Years passed, and his mind began to seek rational explanations. As a teenager, recalling the event, he told himself it had been some prank by local kids, and he went on living with that thought. But tonight, everything changed. He remembered that childhood night and that overwhelming, uncontrollable fear. Vadim was pulled out of his thoughts by his grandmother offering him more tea. "Granny," he dared to ask, "I really want to know what happened tonight." "Such things shouldn't be spoken of before bed," she sighed. "And those who walk the swamps mustn't even be thought about after sundown." Realizing he wouldn't get an answer, Vadim let it go. But sleeping peacefully that night proved impossible. Dreams, nightmares, one after another. Each time he closed his eyes, even for a moment, he was back in the swamps. Dark shadows reached for him with clawed hands or tentacles. He cried out and sat up in bed, drenched in sweat. He knew it was just a dream tried again to sleep, but the nightmares kept pulling him back. Only toward morning did Vadim finally fall into a deeper sleep. But this was no ordinary dream. He dreamed the following. He was back in the swamp. Once again, black shadows wandered nearby, but this time they stayed at a distance, as if an invisible barrier kept them away. Yet, he stood ankle deep in water, surrounded by marsh, and had no idea where to go. Suddenly, he caught a flicker of light out of the corner of his eye. He remembered that he wasn't supposed to look, but he turned his head anyway and saw something curious. A girl was approaching him. She wore a long dress, yet the hem didn't get wet in the swamp muck, as if she wasn't walking, but floating above the surface. In front of her drifted a tiny light, like a candle flame. She moved quickly, and Vadim felt no fear as he watched her. The girl floated forward, her eyes lowered, as if sleepwalking. But as she passed beside him, she turned her head and her eyes opened. They were golden green, glowing from within. She looked straight at Vadim and said, with a nod, "Follow me. I'll lead you out of the bog." And Vadim followed. The little flame floated ahead, the girl gliding behind it without touching the ground. Vadim walked after her. He saw that his feet stepped only on dry tufts of earth, even though water surrounded him. He was being led along the right path. Finally, rooftops appeared in the distance. The village was close. Vadim found himself on a dirt road. He turned to the girl to thank her, but she interrupted. "Ask your grandmother. Press her. She knows who I am and who they are. Don't give up. Now go. The shadows won't touch you. I'll make sure your path is safe." And Vadim went. Everything felt too real. The same road he and Grandpa had walked for years, the same houses. He could feel his body vividly, the night's chill, the wind's breath, and that heavy fear emanating from the swamp. But the shadows stayed far away. This time, he knew they wouldn't come closer. They wouldn't reach him, wouldn't touch him. Then the house. Opening the gate, Vadim entered the yard and woke up. He sat up in bed again, brushing away the remnants of sleep. And in his ears, the girl's voice still echoed. "Press her, she knows." Part 3. The first rays of the rising sun adorned the curtains with pink highlights. The clock showed 5:30 early morning, but Vadim knew he wouldn't be able to fall asleep again. He quietly got up, went to the kitchen, and put the kettle on. The curtains on the kitchen window were still tightly drawn. He approached and pulled them apart, letting in the sunlight, then opened the window. A fresh breeze filled the kitchen with the scent of early grass and young leaves. From the window, a narrow strip of river and marshes could be seen, stretching off toward a wall of light green forest. The mist hadn't yet dissolved and hung like a light veil over the grass, especially near the water. By the way, this is where the story begins. "You're up early," came his grandmother's voice from behind. Hearing him rustling around in the kitchen, she decided to get up too. "Can't sleep? I had troubling dreams. After those, it's impossible to fall asleep," Vadim replied. "No wonder," Grandma muttered. "Did you see something yesterday? When I came home, a flame floated through the air, and behind it walked a figure," Vadim said plainly. His grandmother looked up at him and fell silent in a long, awkward pause, as if at a loss for words. "You know what I saw. Tell me. It's better not to talk about it," she tried to deflect. "No, Grandma. I'm not a kid anymore, and it's morning outside. I want to know what the hell is going on here." Vadim said it in such a tone that his grandmother gasped and sat down. She took on a tragically sorrowful expression. But what used to work on Vadim when he was a child had no effect now. "I had a dream," he continued. "A girl with green eyes appeared. She led me out of the marshes and drove off monsters. She said you know who she is and who they are." Grandma stirred, and before Vadim's eyes, the blood drained from her face as she turned completely pale. "Grandma, we're not leaving this kitchen until you tell me everything." His grandmother sighed, nodded, and while pouring tea, began. "Avdotya, that was her name, the girl you saw. A terrible evil was committed. But the price for it was great. The marshes weren't always here. Back in the Tsar's time, a beautiful estate flourished in this place. A luxurious park surrounded it. Carriages, ladies in elegant dresses, they say. Even the Tsar himself once visited. But the estate's owner was no ordinary man. Oh no, far from it. In his quest for power, and more importantly, eternal life, he conducted satanic rituals. How do you know all this, Grandma? My great-grandmother worked as a maid in that estate. This story has been passed down as family lore, from mouth to mouth. At first, they just dabbled in magicharmless rites, summoning spirits, fun, private parties. But over time, the darkness took hold of the estate owners' hearts. They started inviting sorcerers, and the rituals became horrifying. They began making sacrifices. At first, animals. It started small dogs, cats. The master's last animal sacrifice was his beloved stallion. But even that wasn't enough. Then came human sacrifices. Oh, those were dark and terrifying times. Wasn't there anyone to stop them? And who would that be? Peasants and servants? They weren't allowed to leave the estate. Distinguished guests? They came specifically to commune with the unholy. They didn't care about the fate of common folk, whose blood fed the dark powers from hell. These lands fell into fear and darkness, and that's when the swamp began. Not all at once, though. Slowly. First, the riverbanks became silty. Then puddles appeared in the forest that never dried. Each spring, the floods grew worse, swallowing peasant homes and pushing them farther away. And did they get anything out of that magic? They did. Money flowed to them like a river. And they didn't age. They really were young, no illness touched them. But their souls already belonged to darkness. And the further it went, the less control they had over their own bodies' dark entities had taken residence in all who participated in those rituals. And where exactly was the estate? Vadim asked. Where the village is now. Number it stood where the heart of the swamp is today. So the swamp grew and swallowed it? Exactly. And now about Avdotya. She was a local healer, a hereditary one. All the women in her line had the gift. Avdotya had many abilities. She healed both people and animals, foretold disasters, could control the weather, and influence the minds of both man and beast. She was the first to sense the darkness spreading in that estate. She warned people, even tried to alert the high-ranking folks. But the commoners were paralyzed by fear, and the nobles didn't care. Back then, many played around with magic. It was a fad. So she turned to nature's power to fight the evil. The swamp that was her doing. Slowly but surely, it crept toward the estate, threatening to drown and destroy it. Avdotya wanted at least to cleanse the land of that family. But they found out who was behind the curse. With the help of demonic forces and corrupt people, they captured her and secretly brought her to the manor. The demon they served demanded her blood. He had always craved the lives of the pure, but Avdotya was his most desired victim. And the servants knew and no one helped her? Vadim exclaimed. People are, by nature, cowardly and selfish. They kept her in the dungeon where they held their rituals, guarded by dark forces. None of the servants dared go near, but the commoners sensed that something even worse was about to happen, and on the night the ritual was to take place, many fled the estate, including my great-grandmother. That's how they saved their lives. What happened next, no one can say. Those who fled didn't see it. Those who stayed didn't survive. Only one thing remains in memory and legend. By morning, the estate and the surrounding park were completely submerged in swamp. You couldn't get close without falling into the treacherous bog. The locals shunned the area, avoided even going near, but many nobles tried to reach the sunken estate. partly to understand what happened, partly to claim the vast riches said to be left behind. And according to rumors, there were plenty. But none of those who ventured into the swamp ever returned. And then they appeared, the swamp shadows. The ones you mustn't look at. The ones that make you stay away from the swamp past sunset. They roam, hungry and cruel, letting no straggler escape. Only the wandering light can save someone. You and Grandpa were lucky. You saw that light, and you even dreamed of it. The sun had risen, bathing the garden outside the kitchen window in warm light. Vadim finished his tea. His head was bursting with thoughts. On one hand, his grandmother's story seemed like a local fairy tale. On the other, he remembered his dream. Too vivid to be just a dream. "There's one thing I don't get," Vadim said, watching the sunlight shimmer. "If everyone knows about the evil in the swamp, why does this village still exist? These places were considered cursed and abandoned until the Soviet government arrived." Grandma replied, "Everyone in the nearby villages knew the legend. Some party activists dug through old documents and found that there was indeed an estate, and its history was very murky. Inspired by the same rumors of untold riches, the new authorities decided to storm the swamp and find the sunken estate. Under the guise of oil exploration, they forcibly relocated people here and founded this village. As you might guess, none who ventured into the marshes returned. Not even the Soviet government could defeat this magic. They tried to drain it, even used explosives, but eventually the survivors scattered, and the village remained. My grandmother was among those brought here, and since her family had long lived in these parts, she stayed. The land here is beautiful and clean. You just have to follow the rules, and the locals have gotten used to it." Having received a complete answer, Vadim, deep in thought, went for a walk to the river. In the sunlight, the marshes looked so alive. Part 4. The light of the full moon, sharp and cold, pierced the skin like icy needles, bringing nightmares. Vadim woke up and lay for a while, with his eyes open, trying to understand what was a dream and what was reality. Finally, he saw that he hadn't drawn the curtains tightly, and a beam of moonlight had fallen on his shoulders. Closing the gap, Vadim lay down again and quickly fell into a troubled sleep. This time, however, he had a vision too vivid and realistic to be just a dream. He saw an estate, old-fashioned and luxurious. Lanterns were lit everywhere, music played, carriages arrived. Vadim observed the scene, feeling like a mere speck in space. At some point, he moved closer, and then, passing through the walls and down, found himself beneath the estate in a long stone corridor. By the way, the beginning of this story is here. The dungeon was also brightly lit with torches. Vadim was drawn forward and found himself in a spacious chamber with high stone vaults. The sight that opened before him was unpleasant. A young woman was being tied to a pillar. She struggled and shouted words. Vadim didn't understand their meaning, but he realized it was a spell. Chains were placed on the woman, one after another, fastened with locks. The locks were sealed with wax, and some kind of seal was stamped on them. But the strangest thing was the floor. It moved. At first, it looked like a haze. Then the floor twitched and began to swirl, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until a rapidly spinning dark vortex formed. At one point, the woman's body went limp, but a bright spot detached from it and formed a steady glowing pillar. And at that moment, a dark whirlwind burst from the vortex. The glowing pillar took the shape of a woman's figure and began to oppose the darkness. And then everything moved. Vadim felt as if he were in two places at once, in the dungeon and outside. Watching the light whirlwind battle the dark one, he also saw how, like a debris flow, the swamps were flooding the park, and then the estate, dragging into the mire everything and everyone who didn't manage to escape in time. Finally, the dark whirlwind rushed back into the vortex, and the floor stopped moving. With a cry, Vadim woke up and sat up. He wiped off his sweat, replaying the images he had seen again and again. When suddenly, an overwhelming drowsiness took over again, and he fell into oblivion. And then he saw her. Avdotya stepped out of the fog into the light, and Vadim saw her face in detail. "You know who I am, and what happened," she said, looking into Vadim's eyes. "I saw how you drove away the black whirlwind. But who were those dark shadows then? The shadows of the swamps became those who offered my body as a sacrifice. They cannot die completely, for they gave up too much for the immortality of their flesh. And I don't let them leave the swamps. So they wander. Angry, greedy. Hunger, that's what they feel, constantly. Every moment of their existence. You must help me. Then I can send the ghouls to the lower worlds, to their master, and free these lands from the curse." "Help?" Vadim was surprised. "But how?" "You saw the seals that bound my body. You must remove them and commit my body to fire. Then I will be free, and my power will grow strong enough to rid us of the filth." "But why me?" "Because you can. I saw your soul that evening when you and your grandfather stayed behind. And I understood that of all who live in this village, you alone can cast away fear and go all the way. What must I do? In an hour, the sun will rise. Don't delay. Take everything you need and go to the place where you fished with your grandfather. While the sunlight chases away the shadows, you'll have time to free me. Don't delay. Get up." Vadim opened his eyes again and got up. His heart was beating faster than usual, but it wasn't fear. He understood that he was the only one who could help. And that meant he would succeed no matter what it took. Getting dressed, Vadim quietly left the house, went to the shed, and packed his backpack with everything he thought might be useful. When everything was ready, he put on the backpack and set off. Early morning. The swamps were still wrapped in mist, but with every step, the light grew stronger. Leaving the village behind, Vadim finally felt fear. The deeper he ventured into the marshes, the more terror consumed him. And then came the thoughts, desperate, chaotic, chastising him for acting like a typical paranoid fool, trusting his dreams and wandering off into the unknown for no clear reason. Fighting off the storm of emotions and thoughts, Vadim finally reached the agreed-upon place and stopped. Silence. Only the distant singing of morning birds from the direction of the village. Then, behind him, a melodious female voice rang out. "You've completed the hardest task you came." He turned around and saw something that completely tore him away from reality. Before him stood a woman only. She wasn't solid, as if she were woven from wind and mist. A beautiful maiden with wings dissolving into a white haze. "Avdotya?" Vadim murmured. "Her too," the maiden smiled. "It was a good body. My power remained in it. But now, listen to me carefully and remember every word." Vadim froze. It felt as if he had stopped breathing, and his heart ceased to beat. "Now, follow the flame of the candle. I will be behind you. No matter what happens around you, no matter what you hairdo, not stop, and do not look back. If you get distracted for even a moment, you will die. Do you understand?" Vadim nodded. "Keep your eyes only on the flame, and listen only to the beating of your own heart. The light will guide you to the estate and lead you into the dungeon. It will light your way, and I will keep the ghouls from touching you. When you reach my body, don't hesitate to tear off the seals and burn the bones. You must act as if you were lifeless, shutting off all feelings and thoughts. Only then will you succeed, and I will reward you generously for your help." The maiden fell silent, peering into Vadim's face. Her eyes flared up, glowing with a greenish light. "Do you agree?" she asked. "If you have doubts, you can refuse. You'll return home, fall asleep, and forget all of this, as if it were a strange dream." "Let's go," Vadim said firmly. "I came. That means I'll see it through to the end. Go." Suddenly, a small flame lit up at Vadim's feet and began to float gently through the tall grass toward the bog. Without a second thought, he followed. "You must be like the dead." These words kept surfacing in Vadim's mind as he stepped deeper into the swamp. The flame truly led him on a safe path. All around was water and bog, but Vadim's feet found dry tufts of land, avoiding mud and mire. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement. It was so fast, it couldn't be clearly seen, but it was definitely there. A cold, sticky fear crept over his spine and scalp. Vadim knew who it was. He wanted to turn and look, but clenched his teeth and fixed his gaze on the flame, still gliding serenely ahead. There was howling, the sounds of struggle. Shadows clashed around him, hitting an invisible barrier they couldn't touch him, just as Avdotya had promised. At last, the sun rose, scattering dazzling glints across the swampy puddles. The shadows retreated. Vadim exhaled in relief and saw a centuries-old stone building right in front of him. He had reached the estate. He hadn't taken his eyes off the flame the entire way and didn't even realize he'd arrived. The flame didn't stop it, floated straight into the gaping black entrance of the stone structure. Vadim followed quickly. As promised, the light in the dungeon became brighter, illuminating everything. Ancient filth, cobwebs, a musty stench. But the deeper he descended, the less afraid he felt, for he sensed the ghostly maiden's presence behind him. At last, he entered a spacious stone hall, the very one he'd seen in his dream. And yes, in the center of the hall stood a pillar. Chained to it were nearly decayed remains. Finding a cleaner spot, Vadim pulled out his tools and got to work. He wrapped a shirt around his nose and mouth to block the smells and avoid inhaling poisonous dust, and began cutting away the locks, breaking the seals. There were 6 of them. It took effort, but progress was steady. All the while, Vadim could see, out of the corner of his eye, a battle at the entrance to the hall. A luminous whirlwind blocked dark figures who growled and howled, trying to break through. After tearing off the final seal, Vadim gathered the remains, doused them in fuel, and lit them on fire. And the more the bones burned, the brighter and denser the glowing white whirlwind became. Then the floor began to move. Vadim froze near the pyre. He had seen this in his dream. And just like in the dream, a vortex opened. But now, no one tried to escape it. On the contrary, the dark shadows which Avdotya had held back all this time writhed and howled, then threw themselves into the abyss, obeying her will. When the last shadow vanished into the void, everything suddenly fell silent. An overwhelming silence filled the space, and Vadim began to look around in confusion, as if waking from a dream. He no longer saw the vortex, or the glowing maiden, or the ghostly flame. The underground chamber was now lit only by a ray of sunlight streaming through a crack in the wall. And it felt like he had wandered into this ancient place, by accident though, and why, he couldn't say. "How long are you going to stand there like that?" The girl's voice behind him made his whole body flinch. Vadim turned and saw a young woman. She wore a traditional peasant dress, but she looked so alive and real that Vadim doubted was she really a ghost. "Avdotya," he mumbled again. "The one and only." She smirked. "Come on, I'll take you out. Or are you planning to sit here till nightfall?" Vadim followed her, and soon they emerged to the surface. The sun was indeed already leaning toward the horizon, though its rays still shone warm and bright. Only then did he realize how tired he was. "Give me your hand," Avdotya said, offering hers. Vadim grasped her hand and felt what he never expected: warmth, softness of skin, the pulse in her veins. Was she truly alive? "All right, that's enough." The girl laughed and pulled her hand back. At that moment, Vadim realized they were now standing by the riverbank, in the very spot where he used to fish with his grandfather. "But how we got here so fast," Vadim began to mumble. "I can put it all back if you want to walk," she giggled. "No." Then Avdotya changed again. Her eyes glowed, her height increased, and behind her unfolded wings as light as mist. She brought her hands to her lips and blew. A glowing golden orb appeared in her palms. "You've done what none before you could, and as promised, I give you a gift." With these words, she placed her hands near Vadim's solar plexus. He felt the orb enter him, filling his body with warmth. And everything changed. It was as if a veil had fallen away, and his eyes were truly opened. Vadim saw the world as it really was, without the matrix of perception. He could hear what was real, feel the flow of energy, understand the hidden mechanics of existence. He knew all the secrets of the universe. He returned home and told no one what had happened that day. He no longer needed to explain or prove anything. The world lay before him exactly as it is. What happened next? The swamps slowly dried up. People's fear faded, and they began to break the old rules. For the dark shadows of the marshes no longer threatened anyone. The abandoned manor was discovered and archaeologists descended upon it. And Vadim, he stayed in that village, choosing peace and quiet over city chaos. In union with the elemental spirit he had freed, he explored the world and grew in wisdom. Among people he became known. And Vadim, he remained living in that village, preferring peace and quiet over the hustle and bustle of the city. United with the elemental spirit he had freed, he continued to explore the world and grow. Among people, he became known as a mage and a healer. But that is another story.